Hey guys, the GioDude here. Normally I put out uncommented Smash content with a couple of exceptions here and there. In this video though, I wanted to try something a little different and decided that I wanted to talk about one of my favorite Sega Genesis games from my childhood that seemingly not very many people know about, and do a quick retrospective of sorts. I'm no gaming historian or King K, heck I can barely make a chart. But I'll do my best to keep you entertained while at the same time try to tell you about a game that I'm really passionate about. I'll be going over a little bit of the game's history, and of course I'll be going over the story and gameplay to see how those fare. So assuming you can bear my monotonous and boring voice, let's get started. So what game are we talking about here? Well, alongside titles like Sonic the Hedgehog and Thunder Force 4, it's a title that has been announced as part of the Sega Ages collection coming to Nintendo Switch, and when I saw it was there, you can bet that I was excited. The name of the game is Gain Ground. I doubt very many of you have heard of the game, as that seems to be the case every time I bring the game up. None of my friends ever heard of it or played it before I introduced it to them, and the majority of people I've talked to are in the same boat. But what exactly is Gain Ground? Gain Ground was developed and published by Sega, and originally released on the Sega System 24 arcade cabinet in 1988. Even for its time, it kinda stood out as an arcade game, with titles like Splatterhouse, Ghouls and Ghosts, Double Dragon 2, Super Contra, and Altered Beast all having their arcade debut that same year. While the previously mentioned titles were either side-scrolling beat-em-ups, a run-and-gun shooter, or an action platformer, Gain Ground was an action strategy game that played entirely from a top-down perspective and also had 3 joysticks which allowed for a simultaneous 3-player co-op. Despite standing out from other games released that year, Gain Ground only managed to make average sales upon its initial release. In a 2003 interview published on the Japanese Sega website, programmer Yoshiki Ooka stated that Gain Ground isn't a game where you just read the instruction card on the side of the cabinet and figure out how to play. So even when it first came out, its sales wasn't anything special. The game was later released on Sega's 8-bit Master System in Europe in 1990, then released in Japan, the US, and Europe on the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive the following year in 1991, which is the version that I grew up playing and is the version that I will be focusing on for this video. Speaking of releases, this game has been on pretty much everything in one way or another. It had a release on the Master System, the Sega Genesis, the TurboGrafx-16, the PS2 and PSP, PS3 and Xbox 360, the Wii, and Steam, alongside its original arcade debut, not to mention its upcoming Switch release. Since its initial release, the game has become something of a cult classic. The developers have gone on record saying that the inspiration for Gain Ground came from Atari's 1985 arcade game, Gauntlet. And it's easy to draw some parallels between the two, with both games having a top-down perspective and having multiple people work together to defeat enemies and reach an exit. Speaking of enemies and exits, let's start talking about the game itself. First, let's get the story out of the way. In my opinion, it's pretty neat and also provides some much needed context. The story found inside the original US instruction manual reads, by the year 3000 AD, the human race had progressed almost to the point of perfection. With no more war, poverty, or discrimination, the worries of mankind seemed to be over. But the human race had created a new crisis for themselves. They had no idea how to defend themselves or survive a major holocaust. A long period of peace had diminished their survival instinct. The United Earth government decided that they needed to stimulate this instinct in the people, to revive their will to fight for their lives if the need arose. So they developed an awesome simulated war environment run by a supercomputer, the Gain Ground system. However, something went wrong while testing the system. It refused all input and went berserk, and all of its creators became captives. The government sent a rescue party, but they too fell captive to the robotic soldiers. After several more futile attempts, one last rescue party was assembled, but if this one failed, the entire system world would have to be destroyed. 3 brave soldiers, carefully selected for the last attempt, have entered this vast hostile battleground, determined to survive and save their fellow men. So basically, we're fighting through virtual battlegrounds against armies of androids to save our friends and escape in one piece. The whole simulation goes rogue idea has probably been done 1,000 times, but it's neat to see it in a game as early as 1988. With that story out of the way, let's get to the meat and potatoes of the game, the gameplay. After the title screen tries to give us a seizure and destroy our bitrate, we jump right into the first level of the game. Right off the bat, we can see that we have a party of characters, and we can scroll through them using up or down. The objective of the game sounds simple enough: defeat all the enemies on the stage, or alternatively, get all of your surviving party members to the exit before time runs out. Either of these will advance you to the next stage. And along the way, we'll be trying to save the captured allies from the story and add them into our party so they can help us out. While the objective sounds straightforward, it's actually trickier than you might expect, which we'll get to in a little bit. Each stage consists of a single screen with a certain amount of enemies on it. In the Genesis version, there are 50 stages, or levels, divided into 5 rounds, or worlds. Each round represents a different era in human history and has its own unique boss fight. Round 1 is the Dark Ages, while Round 2 is the Medieval Ages. Round 3 is pre-revolutionary China, Round 4 is the Modern Era, and Round 5 is the future. I always loved advancing through time like this, and it's especially silly to think about the fact that you're using rifles and rocket launchers to take out enemies with bows and arrows. The opening stages of the game do a pretty good job of teaching us the game's most important mechanics. The first level is open and free of any obstacles besides the enemies, which are all clearly visible and don't move that fast. You can run around for a bit and play around with the controls without much fear of being hit. There in plain sight is a captured ally, and if we touch it, we can see that he starts following us, teaching us that they can be picked up. One small issue here is that the game never tells you that to actually save the character and add them to your party, you have to get them to the exit, which also means that at least one enemy has to be left alive, otherwise the stage will end. Assuming you've read the manual which tells you how to save allies, this isn't too big of a deal, but for new players who have just jumped in without any prior knowledge, I can see this being a problem, especially since you'll want to gather as many allies as possible. This leads us into another major game mechanic, which are the allies themselves. You start the game with the 3 brave soldiers from the story, Johnny, Betty, and Ashura, and they each have their own strengths and weaknesses. Each character has a specialized main weapon, and a smaller, sometimes weaker sub-weapon. Each character's primary weapon, weapon type, and weapon direction are denoted below their character selection portrait. L means low, H means high, and M means magic. These weapons differentiate each character and make allies useful in different ways. For example, Johnny has great range with his rifle, allowing him to hit ground level enemies from a safe distance. His main weapon is a single shot forward. While it may sound useless, it's actually pretty helpful as it allows him to fire ahead while moving, letting him strafe and retreat while attacking. Ashura's main weapon is a spear that can be thrown in an arc, and it can be thrown over ledges in any direction, allowing him to hit both enemies on ground level and ones out of reach on elevated surfaces. However, he doesn't have much range. This makes him not particularly useful for combat, but excellent at rescuing fallen party members due to his fast movement speed. Betty's main weapon lets her lob grenades over ledges in front of her, and also lets her throw grenades while retreating or strafing. While she has average movement speed, her grenades do more damage than a standard shot. In this way, the quote-unquote power-ups aren't regulated to an item or upgrade and instead regulated to your allies. Collecting many allies expands the range of abilities at your disposal and also extends your hypothetical life bar since each ally takes 1 hit before being defeated. There are 20 unique allies in the game, each with their own abilities, but throughout the game you can find duplicates of some characters. This allows you to have more than one of a particular ally, and provides some leniency if you happen to have lost a certain ally in a previous stage. Understanding each character's unique attributes is the key to victory in Gain Ground. This is where the complexity and strategy in Gain Ground comes from, assessing the situation and choosing the right allies for the job. Some stages might be suited for a character with exceptionally long range, while another stage might be suited for a character with curving boomerangs, allowing them to easily hit enemies behind cover. My only gripes with the ally mechanic is that some allies certainly feel like clones of other allies, with only minor changes like which way their primary weapon fires. And some allies are undoubtedly more useful than others. I find myself never ever using characters like Honey in general. Honey is just outclassed by other units who do her job better, and General is, well, generally useless. In the Master System version of the game, there's a ninja ally that throws ninja stars and can place traps to catch and defeat enemies with. It would have been cool to see more allies like this in later versions of the game. Moving on to the second and third stages, we learn more vital information, that enemies can be behind cover or out of reach on ledges, and that enemies can ambush us from off screen. The best example of this are these 2 enemies who rush in and chase us down this closed path to the exit, which makes sure that the player notices them. This in turn teaches the player 2 things. The first is that if you don't have a character with vertical range, booking it for the exit might be your only option. The second is to keep an eye on the enemy counter. The enemy counter is located at the top of the screen next to the timer, and tells us how many enemies there are on the entire level. This includes enemies that aren't visible, so if we enter a level and see that there's a disparity between the amount of enemies on screen and the enemy counter, we know that something isn't right, and we can expect some enemies to try and take us by surprise. The next couple of stages play around with these mechanics and give you a bit of time to get used to them. There isn't anything too difficult in round 1, with the only major exception being this fort in 1-6 and the round boss. Speaking of bosses, now that we're at the first boss in the game, we can see that there's no exit in the stage. This is true for every boss stage in the game, with the exception of the boss of round 2. This means that any allies we lose here are lost forever, which in my opinion is a good way to raise the stakes during boss stages, since in normal stages you can recover allies and add them back into your party if you happen to get hit. After we defeat the first boss, we get sent to round 2, the medieval ages. We can almost immediately tell that the enemies here are tougher than the ones we've seen so far. This is the case with each round and time period we advance to. The enemies we face become more sophisticated and tougher than the last. For example, in the Dark Ages the enemies mostly use simple bow and arrows, but in the medieval ages enemy bows shoot farther and more rapidly, and regular enemies start wearing armor that makes them take multiple hits. Going further, the enemies in pre-revolutionary China used guns instead of bows and arrows, giving them drastically improved range. They also throw bombs, as well as hide in ditches that require a character with vertical range to reach. These ideas of gathering various allies with special abilities to advance through time and face more and more advanced enemies is what kept me coming back to the game again and again, even as a kid, even though I could never beat the game. Even now, I find these mechanics to be really fun and unique. It makes me wonder how cool it would be to see the premise of Gameground done with a modern take in a new game. However, here in the second round of the game is where Gameground's main issue starts to show. And that issue is the difficulty. To elaborate, the fact that the game is difficult isn't a problem. I enjoy a good fair challenge in games. I thought games like Hollow Knight, Cuphead, and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze did difficulty exceptionally well for the most part. Though I'll acknowledge that these aren't exactly one-to-one comparisons. The problem here is that after the first round, you run into a pretty massive difficulty spike. The first round isn't anything too challenging, it's certainly doable even for inexperienced players, but unless you're prepared, round 2 will probably kill your run. On top of enemies having a faster fire rate and taking more hits, there are also loads of new enemies like Axe Knights that will chase you down and outrun your character, teleporting wizards that can catch you off guard with their fireballs, especially in tight spaces, and also these green blobs that you can't hit until they start chasing you. This is in conjunction with trickier map layouts that give enemies more of an upper hand. From here on out, something that didn't matter too much before starts to make its presence known. And that thing is the time limit. Remember when I said that one way to advance to the next stage was to get your surviving party members to the exit before time runs out? What I didn't tell you is that anyone who doesn't reach the exit before the timer hits 0 is immediately killed, meaning that your entire party can be wiped out if you don't beat all the enemies in time. This also means that if you only got 3 allies to the exit, well, good luck. You're gonna have to make do with just those 3 allies until you can find another in a stage. And those 3 allies may be totally unequipped to deal with the next couple of stages, making another dangerous escape to the exit your only option. Well, I don't think the timer mechanic is a bad thing. I think that the difficulty spike here kind of just feels like an archaic remnant of the game's arcade origins. I know that as a kid I could never beat the game even as much as I played it. Even though you get a couple of continues, it can be frustrating to get to later rounds in the game only to be shut down and have to start again from the beginning since there is no save or password system. I think the phrase quarter sucker is an appropriate way to describe the spike in difficulty here. After all, as I mentioned, Gameground has its origins as an arcade game, so in a way it's unsurprising that after the first round the game throws a big spike like this one at you. Some of the hazards and hidden enemies in later stages can just feel downright unfair and cheap in my opinion. Some examples of this are the wizards on 2-8 that launch fireballs at you the moment you spawn in, which means that unless you are really quick or expecting them, you'll probably be hit. There's also these mini enemies on 3-1 that have weirdly long invincibility frames when they get spawned in, as well as these hidden enemies on 4-6, which suddenly rush in from behind when you defeat certain enemies on the edges of the screen, with almost no wiggle room for the player to avoid them. Not to say that every stage has this problem. These instances aren't the norm for each stage, but the times they do show up can be really terrible, especially when you lose an ally or two. And it only keeps getting harder after round 2, with the exception of round 5, which I actually think is a little easier than round 4. Even more unfortunate, one of these instances of borderline unfair difficulty happens to be the game's final boss. I'm about to go into the final boss, how to beat it, as well as the endgame, so if you don't want spoilers, here's a timestamp, not that it matters too much. After you beat the armies of robots and weird orb things in round 5, you reach the final boss of the game. The final boss pits you against the Gameground defense system, and unless you know its attack patterns, unless you know its easy kill strat, or unless you have an abundance of allies in your party, You probably won't win here on your first run. I know I didn't. The boss lies behind these green walls that you'll need to break in order to reach it and do damage. All the while, it fires homing missiles that are pretty much impossible to dodge without a fast character. And also does this attack where it fires out bullets. This boss will just pick off each one of your party members one by one with no hesitation. If you're stuck with only slow characters, then you might as well just reset the game yourself. The only real way to beat it without losing any party members is to choose a character while the missiles are fired so that your spawn invincibility lets you avoid them and gives you time until the boss fires more. Destroy these green walls as fast as you can, then skedoodle to this safe zone where the bullets actually can't hit you and start attacking the boss as much as you can. The timing is also really tight unless you have a fast character, since you can get stuck on the edges of the green walls rather easily and waste valuable time. But once you beat this monstrosity, you're on top of the world, and you beat the game. After you input your initials for the leaderboard, you get treated to a small but satisfying cutscene. It's definitely not much of a reward for beating such a difficult game, but I think it's a heartfelt little ending sequence, and it's important to think about the context of which this was released, since it was an arcade game. I remembered the feeling of pride and slight nostalgia seeing the heroes of Gameground fight the baddies at the end credits, and I've always wondered how a Gameground show or remake would look like if it was done with modern technology. I know that there was a Japan-only remake on PS2, but it really looks like sort of a budget title in my opinion. I didn't want to spend too much time talking about this game, seeing how it's my first video of this kind, and I didn't want to talk in depth about every stage and every round. Trust me, I could go on and on about every stage, every ally, and every boss for probably more than an hour. But to sum up my thoughts on the game, I think Gameground is one of Sega's hidden gems. It has such charm to it with its unique gameplay, great music, and an awesome concept with the adventure through human history. Despite its sometimes frustratingly hard difficulty, I would recommend giving it a shot with a friend or two, especially if you're into arcade games, or if you're just a sucker for punishment. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I can compare the difficulty to playing a stage in the Mega Man series. At least for me, I would get a certain distance before losing all my lives. Or perhaps get to the boss, but spend the rest of my lives learning their pattern. But just like in the Mega Man games, I think the satisfaction of beating a boss and getting further in the game is what drives you past the punishment. Except when you lose, you're sent all the way back to the start of the game instead of the start of a stage or something. Unfortunately for Gameground, this also means a lot of repetition if you want to get far into the game, or beat it for that matter. But once you figure out what works for each stage, it's a blast to breeze past each round. It was a little difficult for me to review and analyze this game from an objective and beginner standpoint, since I have such fondness for the game and have been playing it for such a long time. My hope is that I did at least a half-decent job at it, or at least kept you entertained for the most part. I'd love to hear your criticisms in the comments, so that I can improve for the next time I try my hand at a video like this. But what about you? Have you ever heard of or played Gameground before this video? Did I do the game justice, and what are your overall impressions of this game? Please feel free to leave your comments down below. And with that, this has been the GioDude, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.